Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Productions channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another Album of the Week episode. This is episode number 242. So, for today's episode, I am here to celebrate the 40th anniversary for Love at First Sting, the 9th studio album for the iconic German rockers Scorpions. Originally released on March 27th, 1984 via both the labels Harvest Records slash EMI, again both for the European market, and then of course Mercury Records for, well, the North American market. And so with that, here to celebrate again 40 years for this album, probably their most biggest record to date, containing some of their most iconic hits. Well, let's begin. After riding high with 3 successful albums, with the previous one, Blackout, proving to be a force to be reckoned with, making huge splashes across the world. So with Scorpions gaining momentum, it was only time for them to expand further on this momentum right back into the studio. In the summer of 1983, initial sessions first took place in Stockholm, Sweden at Polar Studios with ex-Rainbow/Dio bass player Jimmy Bain and ex-Rainbow drummer Bobby Rondinelli, who of course Joel Lynn Turner era, starting with Difficult to Cure, and then of course culminating with Straight Between the Eyes. According to the story here, Francis Buchholz was apparently in the studio all the time and didn't mind Jimmy filling in for him at all. Not sure where Herman Rarebell fits into all of this, as it's not quite explained, I guess. However, still to go on, again, according to Jimmy Bain himself, the day he finished his 3 or 4 months as a part-time Scorpion, he flew to London and, of course, ended up filming the Rainbow in the Dark music video with Dio. During these early sessions, though, early versions of Big City Nights, Crossfire, and Coming Home were recorded, but obviously were scrapped. You can find these demos on YouTube, again, these demos being the versions that were recorded with Jimmy Bain on bass and Bobby Rondinelli on drums. Either way, it's a very cool fact to kind of bring up, and it definitely serves its purpose as part of the story for the recording of this iconic album for Scorpions. Finally, the final recording for their 9th album here would once again be taken back to producer Dieter Dierks' studio, located in Stolmeln, West Germany. About 11 tracks were recorded, with 9 being ultimately chosen. The 2 leftover tracks being Living at Night and Anytime (You Want It), which pretty much were sort of unfinished, especially in the case of Anytime You Want It. Still, these tracks would see the light of day as part of the 2015 deluxe reissue for Love at First Sting. Finally, by March 27th of 1984, Love at First Sting would be released and be seen to massive success that would cement the band as one of the biggest rock bands to ever come out of Germany. However, this is still not again without some slight controversy surrounding the artwork, as apparent with some of the previous Scorpions albums except for Blackout. However, they were right back at it again with this album. And according to the story here surrounding it, the original cover art was created by Koklowski, which is a German graphic design company, and features a photo shot by renowned German photographer Helmut Newton. Despite the record company having shown the original cover art to retailers without any concerns, a complaint by none other than the global mega corporation that is known as Walmart in the US after the album was released resulted, again, this is just the complaints from Walmart. All of this just resulted in Polygram Records issuing a clean cover for use in several department stores chains. The alternate cover, of course, was designed to be less controversial by simply showing a photo of the band members, which was about the same photo as the one on the inner sleeve. Somewhat similar to the case of having to be made for Virgin Killer, where basically they had to use a different sort of band photo that sort of is similar to the one that we'll see on the back cover for the album. However, it was just a bit of a different photo shot or whatever, from the same sessions to be used as the censored version for that album. So they did about the same thing here for Love at First Sting, but just using a photo and just substitute, because even though there was no tit at all that was shown here, I mean, it's not like what happened with Entrance where they had to kind of just brush it out, with black fade or something. This is about the same thing here, but it just was so provocative, and it somehow offended the sort of ultimately family-friendly, religious sort of mentality that Walmart seems to hold. They got mad over Leprosy, the Death album, so they got mad over this. Either way, it doesn't matter. Eventually, it didn't hurt the album's sales. If anything, it probably further expanded the album's sales for Love at First Sting. So here we go. Again, before I also even go any further, this is also considered one of the first heavy metal albums to be recorded digitally, since this was a new phenomenon during this period, basically to record albums and music digitally, and therefore becoming a method that has stayed today. So here we go. Finally, let's get into the track listing for the album again, featuring 9 tracks, clocking at the length of 41 minutes and 15 seconds. These 9 tracks are, of course, kicking off with Bad Boys Running Wild, the ever so iconic Rock You Like a Hurricane, then into I'm Leaving You, Coming Home, The Same Thrill, the also other rather iconic Big City Nights, As Soon as the Good Times Roll, Crossfire, and then ending with another iconic hit off this album, the ballad Still Loving You. And there you go, folks. There's your 9 tracks. So, with Scorpions pretty much, with the lineup changes that first really started to really become apparent by the tail end of the 70s with Uli John Roth pretty much leaving, and then of course being replaced by Matthias Jabs, then moving into, ushering in albums like Love Drive, and then into the 80s with Animal Magnetism. While their popularity started to grow more, some fans in the beginning were kind of starting to feel a little bit alienated, but not to the point to where they would feel betrayed. However, once they started breaking even bigger with Blackout, especially with the hit like No One Like You, and maybe possibly Arizona, there was, as somewhere beneath the surface, a bit of growing dread that they were starting to kind of become more focused on growing into the US. And while you can't necessarily say that Love at First Sting here was a really huge disappointment for, let's say, the old school diehard fans that grew up with their stuff in the 70s and grew to somewhat enjoy their early 80s stuff. But this album, sure enough, signaled the end for the Scorpions, as everyone else knew. It's obviously no secret that this album produced several big hits, but it's definitely here with Love at First Sting is where you start to notice the shift in tone towards the more poppier sense of writing that would forever change the band's sound. Like for instance, a song like Crossfire, where there really isn't any hard rock and drive to it. So while the band were most definitely experimenting with different beats and tempos, like again with the aforementioned Crossfire, they still were sticking to the same formula of that heavy driving rock that they've cemented since Love Drive, and of course maybe prior to that were kind of seen as still small sort of experimentations, whatever, during the Uli Jon Roth period. Still, with an album opener like the classic Bad Boys Running Wild, which is easily one of the album's finest bangers along with Coming Home, which, speaking of that tune, starts off really calm, throwing you for a loop, making you believe that it's going to be a ballad, but minutes in, it decides to throw you into a meat grinder and pull your face off, turning into a blistering headbanger that features some great dual guitar playing between Schenker and Jabs. So, while these may be good examples of this album's power, however, I feel in comparison to the previous barn burner, Blackout, it sort of falls short. I mean, I'm Leaving You has some sort of muscle to it, but doesn't quite reach that high peak level that Bad Boys Running Wild and Coming Home holds, you know, but it isn't too weak. Then there is Big City Nights, which also almost comes close, but isn't nearly as striking as the previous mentioned. By the way, I'm not going to elaborate too much on Rock You Like a Hurricane. Yes, it's this album's biggest hit and the band's biggest ever, being used in countless of different media. I first remember hearing this back in the day in a Red Lobster commercial. I say no more. Anyways, don't get me wrong, it's a fun song, but it's not entirely my favorite on the album. It does have plenty of hooks, but just like how I feel towards songs like You Shook Me All Night Long and Living After Midnight, it doesn't hold that same spark, anymore for me. But I'm not going to entirely skip it when it comes on, but I just feel that because of how many times it has been played, I'd kind of just want to focus on the other songs on the album here. So, there you go. So, speaking of some of the final songs here, for example here, like The Same Thrill, which is a fine energetic rocker, but again, compared to the fast tempo rockers of before, and then compared to Coming Home on the album here, it feels sort of bland in comparison. It's decent, but I just get no real satisfaction from hearing it to the same degree that I did prior with Dynamite or Another Piece of Meat. So that's all I can really say for that track. Then we have As Soon as the Good Times Roll. This track kind of seems to be harking back to the sort of Is There Anybody There, or maybe some of the more lighter or somewhat interesting feel songs that you would find on Animal Magnetism, but it's got some cool sort of hooks in there. It does have an interesting feel. However, even with all of that, not a whole lot to write home about. But again, it's far from a huge snoozer. I can still, listen to it and let it play and still somewhat enjoy the track, but just not to the same extent of some of the previous songs that I've already kind of mentioned. Some of my favorites already being like Bad Boys Running Wild and Coming Home. Finally, let's get to the final track here. That is the album's greatest ballad, even I dare say up there as one of Scorp's finest ballads next to the likes of In Trance, Holiday, and even Born to Touch Your Feelings. And that is Still Loving You. Need I say no more? It's an emotional song with some of the finest melodies, great vocal performance from Klaus Mein, just great guitar solos and playing from Rudolph here, and even jabs as well. It's just all around a great song and easily is one of the best here alongside Bad Boys Running Wild and Coming Home. So, really, this album to me produced about 3 fantastic tracks, so that's all I gotta say there. This album, again, produced by Dieter Dierks, for some reason, he really makes it sound slick. Though, again, it's somewhat held back, within the production here as, compared to his style before. Again, he does manage to give this album an explosive, bombastic sound like he always has. Let's say even during this same period, he was starting to kind of become more like the go-to guy alongside, let's say, Tom Allom or Michael Wagner was starting to kind of get his name out there. And Michael Wagner, working with Dieter Dierks on the French metal band's Warning's second album, Warning 2, which is a absolutely fantastic album. And it's definitely no different here for Love at First Sting in terms of its album's production and its sound, and it is definitely still really good, and it does manage to even make some of the weakest songs on here sound really loud and powerful. Still though, I'm not saying that I completely dislike this album. It's miles above any Def Leppard album past Pyromania, but it lacks the oomph of previous albums. Sort of feeling tired in some of the songs' departments here. Almost as if they were trying too hard to write songs that had that same fire of the previous albums. But, again, this is just my asshole opinion. Still, I can't say anything too bad about the album. I just feel in comparison, it kind of is sounding really tired in terms of continuing with this, and maybe it's understandable why they had to kind of move in much more different directions and had to spice things up for them, but yet, well, as you can see, it would further jade, well, their core original fan base. Forever. So while Love at First Sting may not be this total huge disappointment, the album that just sounds hugely far removed from the albums of old, this underneath it pretty much felt like this was signaling the end and pretty much them moving more and more towards the more Americanized sound that obviously Scorpions would adopt from here on out, that eventually would become pretty much expand even more into this sort of big gigantic monster like Savage Amusement. And then, while they might have kind of started to tone down a little bit by, let's say, Crazy World and Face the Heat, it still didn't feel the same as it did much before. So, that sort of classic, old school, iconic Scorpion sound that pretty much brought them to fame in the early to mid 80s started, it just was changing more drastically and becoming way more reliable on, like, pop hooks and even just more glossier, more slicker production as everything was somewhat changing. But still, that's not to say that there hasn't been any bad albums afterwards. Here and there has been some underrated albums like the aforementioned Crazy World or Face the Heat and maybe Unbreakable from 2002. And I would even dare to say the most recent one, Rock Believer, being one of those underrated albums so far. So with that, still, nothing will ever come close to the Scorpions of old, and with Love at First Sting, this was just the beginning of the end, for certain. But with all that said, again, for those who obviously grew up listening to this album, and if you were one of those that was somewhat pleased with this album or disappointed with this album, well, you know what to do. And with that, if you have any thoughts, whether they're either, again, positive or negative, you can leave them all down in the comment section below. But if you have yet to check out this album, yes, this is one of the most popular, their biggest breakthrough US album, containing some of the most biggest hits that are still arena staples to this day. Yes, it is worth checking out. However, if you want to really at least get at the core of Scorpions, to understand them much more sufficiently, I would propose you to go backwards and check out the stuff earlier. But don't ever at least try and neglect this album. This definitely should be at the top of your list to check out, even if I don't consider this to be one of my absolute favorite Scorpions album. But I do understand its importance to the band and to the band's history and to the just overall this mechanism that is the hard rock and heavy metal genre. So I understand that. Still though, it's not a terrible record by any means. I think it's overrated, but that's about it. Still, it's worth checking out. So there you go. I don't want to babble on too long. I hope all of you enjoyed this episode. So with that, if this is, of course, Heavy Thrasher saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone. And again, happy 40th anniversary to Love at First Sting.